Can I?
One more moment. Okay.
Okay, great. So I can start?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Duncan Pritchard. I'm a professor here at UCI, and I'm also the director of the director of the Centre for Knowledge, Technology and Society. And I'm very pleased to welcome Chris Ranalli, who's at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. He's going to be giving one of the social and applied epistemology. We have a social and applied epistemology lecture series that we've been running now for about 5 years. Annalisa Cleaver and myself set it up. It actually is older even than the centre. And it showcases work on social and applied epistemology. And I'm delighted to have Chris here. I see the title of his talk has just disappeared off my screen, but just to remind myself. Is it still Integrity and Open-mindedness, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so usual rules apply. We're recording this. If you have questions, then put your hand up or type it into the chat, but we're all set. So Chris, if you want to take it away.
Yep, let me just go to the slides and go to play. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, can you see that, Duncan?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, good, okay. Let's see.
Just put it, if you put in presenter and then it will, so we
Like
can
that?
see, that's it, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my title is Integrity and Open-mindedness. And let me just start by noting a widespread intuition in philosophy. And it's that in cases of disagreement between reasonable people, we should be conciliatory. That is, we should sort of budge on our beliefs. And this sort of reflects the ideal of open-mindedness. So the idea here is something like being an open-minded person, at least in the case of open-mindedness towards our peers or reasonable people, demands more of us than it might ordinarily demand of us in, say, just a conversation with a stranger or an acquaintance. So if we want to be open-minded persons, especially towards our reasonable interlocutors and also our peers, that is, people who are just as competent as we are with respect to a particular topic, we really need to ask, does this have any limits? And if so, what are those limits? So here I want to think about your highly personal beliefs and commitments. So if you have children, then I'm sure you believe that your children love you. And of course, you also believe that for yourself with regard to them. So you believe that you love them as well. If you have a spouse, you probably believe that your spouse loves you. And likewise, you believe that you love them. And if you have friends, then you probably believe that they love or at least are deeply care about you, and likewise with respect to your relation to them. But now let's imagine that your peer or a otherwise reasonable interlocutor believes that there's no such thing as love. So perhaps they've read lots of articles from social psychology and cognitive psychology detailing a kind of skepticism about the existence of love, or perhaps they've read lots of philosophy, which is skeptical of love. And for that reason, they're not at all confident that love even exists. And for that reason, they deny what you believe, right? So they think your beliefs are not actually true, that no one really loves anyone on their picture. So here's the question. Should you suspend judgment about whether your friends or your partner or your children love you? So So that's the question here that I want to wrestle with today. Okay, so the view I'm going to be arguing for is kind of a mouthful, so just bear with me. The personal partiality view. So it's the idea that it's permissible to maintain your personal and interpersonal beliefs in response to these kinds of challenges. That is, challenges like reasonable and pure disagreement. And I have a little caveat here, which says that it's a prima facie permission. That means you're permitted to do this unless there's really outstanding reasons not to. So it's kind of like the default position. You're always kind of permitted to maintain these personal, interpersonal beliefs in response to these kinds of disagreements, unless there's really strong reasons that tell against it. So that's my view. So I'm going to tackle a particular problem facing this kind of view, which I call the bad beliefs problem, as you can imagine. So you might think that this kind of personal partiality that I'll be advocating for licenses a kind of objectionable dogmatism, or maybe even a kind of prejudice. So I'm going to take some time to respond to that problem. There's also another problem here, which is more theoretical or philosophical, and that problem is the incomparability problem. So it seems like the pressure we get from our peers in cases of disagreement is really epistemological. They're giving us epistemic or rational reasons to revise our prior beliefs. But what I'm really arguing is that it's prudentially good or prudentially right for you to maintain your beliefs. But then how do we really compare these kinds of reasons, the epistemic reasons on the one hand and the prudential on the other? Okay, so here's the plan for the whole talk. It's really structured around my argument. So you could see the talk is really a kind of argumentative talk where I'm sketching the main argument and defending it. So first, I'm going to introduce some of the key terms, since a lot of the terms are sort of theoretical, located in epistemology. And then I'll detail my main argument. And then I'll defend the two premises of my argument. So it's just a two-premise argument. And then finally, I'll come to some objections and offer my initial replies. And then I'll be really interested to see what your own questions and what your own potential objections might be. But hopefully, I can persuade at least some of you, I hope. But we'll see. Maybe you will persuade me otherwise. Okay. So first, I need to introduce what I mean by these kinds of personal, interpersonal beliefs. So we can just kind of go by example first. So things like that your children love you, or that you love your children, you love your friends and that they love you, your close siblings and family, that they care about you, that you love your spouse or partner and that they love you. And it's the kinds of beliefs which I think are necessary for the authenticity of your interpersonal relationships. So the thought is that if you really are authentically engaged in these kinds of relationships, then these kinds of beliefs are the ones that you need to have. So insofar as they really are relationships of love, and insofar as you really are authentically engaging in these kinds of relationships, then these are also the kinds of cognitive attitudes you need to maintain and keep on board insofar as those relationships are realized. Sometimes they also entail more general commitments. So let's just take one of my own. So I think my sister, close sibling, that her life is worth living. And she's someone with very severe intellectual disabilities. So my belief then entails that people with severe intellectual disabilities can have meaningful lives. They can have lives that are worth living. That's one of my personal convictions. And these kinds of personal beliefs, to kind of just hone in or narrow down to the kinds of beliefs I'm talking about, we can call them identity or meaning conferring beliefs. So they're beliefs which play a role in regulating who you are, your narrative self, or perhaps they play a role in regulating your personal projects, or what Bernard Williams called your deeply held projects. That is, these are sort of the projects that give you the sense that you're living for something. So you're not merely going through life day to day, but you're living for something, right? You can really say to yourself, this is what I'm living for. This is what brings meaning into my life. This is what sustains the person that I am. So it's beliefs which play an essential role in those kinds of projects. And I think there's clear examples of this from history, of course. So Martin Luther King's beliefs about racial justice are arguably identity and meaning conferring beliefs, or were for Martin Luther King. And to try to figure out what kinds of beliefs they might be for you, you just ask yourself the question, okay, what am I living for? And then think about the kinds of beliefs which are such that if you were to drop them, it would be really hard for you to answer that question sincerely, right? You would struggle to answer that question. Okay, so this is just some kind of I guess a kind of rough and ready way of introducing the idea. Okay, let's now think about open-mindedness for a moment. So if you're an open-minded person, that just means that you sort of consider seriously relevant intellectual challenges to your beliefs. You have a standing willingness to do this. So this is the idea I take from Heather Battley. And open-mindedness can be more or less demanding, right? So imagine my colleague who doesn't know anything about a particular theory that I do know a lot about, challenges my theory, my theory in that area. In that case, I should probably be, open-minded. So I should consider seriously their challenge, but I don't necessarily need to give it as much weight as I give my own, given that I know a lot more about it than they do. But by the same token, my peer, who I know knows a lot about that particular topic, imagine they challenge my theory. In that case, because I know that they're my peer, and I know that they know a lot about it, I know that they're very competent, I know that they've studied this subject matter for a long time and are no more likely to make a mistake about these matters than I am. In that case, then I need to accord them, or at least their judgments, a lot of weight. That's what's really, I think, demanded by open-mindedness when I'm dealing with a peer. Now, if I'm dealing with an expert or an authority, someone who knows even more than me, granting that I know a lot about the topic, and they challenge my theory, then I need to give them even more weight than I give myself, right? So I need to give their judgment a lot of weight. So that's what I mean when I say open-mindedness demands, can be more or less demanding depending on the source of the challenge, where that source is coming from. So maybe open-mindedness demands very little of you if you're just browsing through a random message board online and catch a criticism of a belief you happen to hold, versus reading a criticism in a very reliable newspaper, or one coming from an expert, for example. Okay, so a view in the philosophy or epistemology of disagreement, rather, it articulates this basic ideal of open-mindedness, I think, with three key principles or theses. And we'll call it, following what's standard in the literature, the equal weight view. So the equal weight view says, first, that your peer's belief gives you the same degree of support to believe that you've made a mistake as your belief gives them a reason to believe that they've made a mistake. So the idea is that you accord each other's verdicts equal weight. The second thought is defeat, and that means that the discovery that a peer disagrees with you about something gives you a reason to believe that you are mistaken about it, and of course vice versa. So when they learn that you disagree with them, that gives them a reason to think that they might have made a mistake. And finally, independence. And this is the principle which says that any reasons you have to discount your peer's verdict in a particular case, it needs to be independent of the reasons you used initially to form your view about that topic, and vice versa. So you can't just rely on reasoning like this. Well, this time around, I've reached the right answer, so you must have gone wrong somewhere. Independence doesn't allow you to respond in that kind of way. Okay, so those are the key terms. Now here's my argument. The first premise says that if the equal weight view is true, then in peer disagreements over your personal and interpersonal views, you must suspend judgment. Ooh. But my second premise, in peer disagreements over your interpersonal views, it's permissible not to suspend judgment. So that's not something you actually have to do. Therefore, either the equal weight view isn't true after all, or else it's permissible for you to disobey the relevant epistemic rationality norms. That is, it's permissible for you in these cases to be irrational. So you might be asking yourself, why is the conclusion an either or? Why is it a disjunction? Well, the reason why is because that first premise there, it's really issuing an epistemic demand. It's saying, hey, if the equal weight view is correct, then rationality requires you all to suspend judgment over your personal and interpersonal convictions. But the second premise is saying, but you don't really need to do that. At least prudentially speaking, you're permitted not to. You have a kind of permission to be, well, at least not to comply with those demands. And so the equal weight view and the personal partiality view that I'm advocating for, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive then. So it could be epistemically rational to revise, suspend judgment, but prudentially permissible not to. And I think this way of thinking about the argument is concessive in all the right ways. So it's concessive towards our conciliatory intuitions, which says, we really need to consider our peers' verdicts, and we need to accord them just as much weight as our own, at least from a rational or epistemic point of view. But it's also concessive to the intuition that we can be steadfast. So it says, look, but even though rationally we ought to be conciliatory, practically speaking, it's all right to be steadfast. So in that way, it's concessive to both sorts of intuition. Okay, so that's one way of seeing the view. And now there's there's two other versions that I want to focus on. So one version is called the encroachment version. And the idea here is this, that because giving up your personal beliefs in accordance with the equal weight view would be really bad for you, that changes the dynamics of what's epistemically rational or irrational. That is, the prudential, or if you like, the moral and prudential, they kind of encroach upon the what epistemic rationality requires of you. So what that would mean then is, if it really is so prudentially bad for you to suspend judgment, then it must not be the case that epistemic rationality really requires that of you after all. And so the equal weight view isn't true. But the version I favor is what I call the overriding version, which says that it's all things considered permissible to disobey epistemic rationality norms sometimes. So on my view, it really is true that it's rational, epistemically rational, for you to suspend judgment even on your personal and interpersonal commitments. But all things considered, really, it's permissible to just ignore that and be irrational. And sometimes that's just what we ought to do. Sometimes we have to just make sacrifices. And in this case, we're making a rational sacrifice. We're sacrificing some feature or some part of our rationality in order to maintain these kinds of convictions. And that's a permissible action. It's a permissible thing to do. Okay, so defending the first premise, that premise is going to be defended by a kind of parity argument. So first we're going to look at just an ordinary case and why the equal weight view entails suspension of judgment in that case, and then just replace it with a personal and interpersonal conviction. So just suppose that the equal weight view is true and you're participating in a peer disagreement. And so the standard case of this is the restaurant example. So imagine that me and a friend have just eaten dinner. We both always tip 20% and split the check. But we're both old fashioned, so we do the calculation in our heads, that we're not using our phones. And we both know that we tend to be right equally as many times. So we do this a lot. So I do the calculation. I come to believe that the cost is $45. And they do the calculation, they come to believe that it's $43, and we're both accounting for the tip. So we share our answers, and we're kind of dumbfounded, about why we came up with contrary verdicts. We're like, well, how did that happen? Okay, so looking at this from an epistemological perspective, here's what's going on. Prior to finding out that we disagree, and prior to disclosing what our reasons are, here are the facts. I believe that the bill is $45 on the basis of my calculation, and they believe that it's $43 on the basis of their calculation. Now, after full disclosure, I show them, like, well, here's the way I calculated in coming to my verdict that's 45. And then my peer goes, well, here is the way I calculated in coming to the verdict that it's 43. Okay, so why can't I or they, my peer here, maintain our beliefs unchanged? Why does the equal weight view pressure us to change it? Well, the reason is independence. That independence principle kicks in. So in evaluating the epistemic credentials of another's expressed belief about P, in order to determine how or whether to modify my own belief about P, I should do so in a way which doesn't rely on the reasoning behind my initial belief. So that's a quotation from David Christensen, who advances this principle. And the reason why this principle is in play is because it's supposed to mitigate dismissiveness. So, if I were to say, well, he disagrees with me this time about P, but since I'm right, then they must be wrong. So however reliable they might usually be, they're not reliable in this particular case. So we don't really need to take their different verdict as a reason at all to question my own belief. So these are the kinds of thinking. This is the kind of thinking that the independence principle is mitigating. So if I were to say, I think you formed a false belief that the bill is $43 because I accurately came to believe that it's 45, that's off limits. Likewise, if I go, well, my reasons really do support thinking it's 45, so you must have made an error in how you evaluated the evidence. Your calculation must have gone wrong. Can't do that. Okay, so zooming in a little bit more then, here's what's going on. We have two kinds of evidence in play. The first is first order evidence, and that's evidence which bears directly on the question of how much how much is the total bill. So my first order evidence is the calculation that the bill is $45 and my memory of having carefully calculated the bill. So I kind of remember, oh yeah, I did this and then I did that. And there's also some higher order evidence. So that's evidence about the quality and existence of my first order evidence, but also my peers and vice versa. So it'll include the fact that I believe that the bill is $45, the fact that my peer believes something different, that the bill is $43, and the fact that my peer is no more likely than I am to have made an error. Okay, with independence in play, however, our first order evidence cancels out because I can't make use of that anymore, and neither can they with respect to their own first order evidence in order to say, hey, you're the one who made an error. And of course, I can't do the same. So that leaves us only with our higher order evidence. The fact that I believe the bill is one thing, the fact that they believe it's another thing, and the fact that we have no more reason to think that we're any more likely than each other to have made an error. So with only that evidence in play, it seems like we have no other choice but to suspend judgment, that would be the rational thing to do. Okay, so now we're just going to do a little switcheroo here. So let's imagine the following disagreement. Me and a friend are eating dinner and get into a conversation about love. And I casually say that friends and romantic partners typically love each other, asserting, well, you know, my spouse loves me, and adding also, my best friend loves me too. And I discovered then that they're extremely skeptical about whether love is real, believing that no one really loves anyone. So what they believe entails that my beliefs aren't correct. And they tell me various theories from personality and social psychology, such as the attachment theory, social exchange theory, and historical fiction theories, which has convinced them of the unreality of love. Okay. You can also imagine the following, worth. So according to this example, I'm having a similar conversation again with a friend who holds the belief, a philosophical view called antinatalism. And this is the idea that everyone would have been better off never having been born. It's also the view that it would be good not to bring anyone else into existence for that very reason. And while my colleague says that he doesn't hold this view, he does hold a view in the neighborhood of it. He thinks that people with severe intellectual disabilities really shouldn't have been born, and that it would be better if they hadn't come into existence, that they kind of lived not so good lives. And so, as a matter of fact, I am the sibling of a severely disabled person, and I think it wouldn't have been better if she had never existed. So I believe, and truly, that her life is worthwhile. So in response, I maintain my conviction. So what's going on from an epistemological point of view, at least if we take seriously this idea of giving each other equal weight? Well, I have some first order evidence, which is my experiences with my friends, with my sister, my spouse, and so on, and my memories. And my friend, they'll also have some experiences and also have some memories, but they even have some more evidence than I do on top of that. They also have their evaluation of theories in psychology and philosophy. So they might disclose that to me in the discussion and say, look, here's the evidence, here's the arguments, here's how they work. But with independence in play, we need to bracket all of that. We can't rely on our first order evidence in order to sort of rule out the other person's judgment. We can't do that. Independence prohibits it. So all we're left then is the higher order evidence that I believe that love exists and that people's lives can be worthwhile, whereas my peer denies it. But we also believe of each other that we're reasonable and that we're no more likely to make an error about this topic than the other. So when I really abstract away from this, I think that of them and they think that of me. So that seems to establish the first premise then. And then that leaves the second premise. So the first premise, if the equal weight view is true, then we've got to suspend judgment, even about our personal, interpersonal convictions. But it seems as though it's permissible not to do that, to really just refrain from doing such a thing. So how are we going to defend that? I have three sort of master intuitions I'd like to draw on. The first has to do with integrity. So the idea here is that substantially changing your interpersonal beliefs would result in substantial changes to who you are. And that's the question. Should you make or be willing to make substantial changes in who you are just to meet the demands of epistemic rationality as it flows from these cases of disagreement? The second intuition has to do with flourishing. So substantially changing your interpersonal beliefs would impact your flourishing, your well-being, your character. It even risks reducing your sense of meaning in your life. And third, the moral intuition, which is that substantially changing these kinds of beliefs would result in harming even some of the people you care most about. So what I'm going to do now is present two arguments for that second premise, which draw on these or develop these intuitions at any rate. Okay, so intuitively, pure disagreement shouldn't move me, and it shouldn't move you to make substantial changes to who you are, and it certainly shouldn't move you to do things which would be harmful towards the people you care most about. Intuitively, that's something, that's not the power it should have. So the two arguments I'm going to give then for that second premise are first the integrity argument, and second, what I call the interpersonal responsibility argument. So first, integrity. Integrity is widely regarded as being morally valuable. And so one question we need to ask here is what is necessary for integrity? And second, we need to ask why is integrity worthy of keeping or cultivating? So it might be true that integrity is morally valuable, but of course, so is being rational. So if there's like a conflict between the two, why is it the case that we should kind of opt for maintaining our integrity rather than maybe losing some of our integrity in order to be rational? So why keep and cultivate it? Okay, so the first question, what's necessary for integrity? Carolyn McLeod says, to have integrity is to adhere to one's own commitments, particularly in the face of challenge. Cheshire Calhoun says, people with integrity decide what they stand for and have their own settled reasons for taking the stands they do. Jennifer Hurt says, a person of integrity is someone who stands virtuously for her commitments. And finally, Greg Shirkowski says, integrity requires sticking to one's convictions, particularly in the face of disagreement, challenge, or temptation. So what I draw from these comments, these reflections, is what I call the standing for requirement. So in brief, a person you're someone of integrity only if there is some belief you have such that you stand for that belief. Okay, of course, integrity, just kind of imagine this reversed, and you believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Maybe you're manifesting integrity there, but maybe you're not doing it appropriately or not doing it virtuously. So integrity needn't always be good. But the idea is that integrity on balance, everything else being equal, is a valuable characteristic. Okay, so the standing for requirement, again, that's our qualification, is that you need to virtuously stand for your personal beliefs. And what that means then is that you need to stand for them in a reason-responsive way. So you can't be totally dismissive towards reasons telling against your conviction. So for example, if my wife were to say, hey, actually, I don't love you anymore, it wouldn't be good for me to go, well, I think you've got to be wrong about that, and maintain my conviction in a steadfast way. I need to be reason-responsive. Of course, there's this question, what kind of reasons really factor in to my deliberation, and I'm going to have a lot more to say about that tomorrow. And the second qualification is that you virtuously stand for P only if, as you stand for P, it's not independently morally harmful. So what I mean there is, like, it might be good for you, or it might not be morally harmful for you to stand for P, but if it very easily morally harms other persons, then it's not a case of virtuously standing for your convictions. So those are the two qualifications. So what is standing for P anyway? What makes it different from merely believing that P? Well, one of the things is that you exercise a degree of resilience in believing that P, so in conditions of challenge and controversy. And what this means is that you would not easily revise your belief in conditions of controversy and challenge. And second, that altering your belief would result in some way compromising yourself or otherwise sacrificing some essential aspect of who you are. So the thought is that you only really are standing for something if you would continue to hold it despite some controversy and challenge. And it's such that were you to alter it, you would compromise the person that you are and maybe potentially even sacrifice some essential aspect of your identity. So I think that this holds for identity conferring or identity related beliefs which are integral to the self, to the person that you are. And they also hold for our meaning conferring beliefs. And these are beliefs that are essential for partaking authentically, again, in those meaning making states of affairs. So going back to those ground projects. So they're the beliefs which are necessary for authentically participating in your ground projects, those projects which are part of the answer to why you're really living the way that you are. Okay, and just to give you an example of where someone believes something but doesn't really stand for it, consider this case. So Marta believes that environmentalism is good, but she's a bit ambivalent about it. So she's liable to quickly change her view in response to adversity. It's not really part of her life. She doesn't have any plans or relationships or commitments centered around that belief. And when she discovers that it's kind of an unpopular opinion at her new job with her new colleagues, who are kind of, attacking this position, she chimes in, well, maybe you're right. Perhaps the government should restrict what companies can and can't do despite their environmental impact. And in that kind of case, we can see that she doesn't stand for environmentalism, even if she believes that environmentalism is good. Okay, so the take-home message here is that the person who stands for something like that, they couldn't revise their position without making substantial changes to who they are, because it would require them to make substantial changes in their commitments or in their relationships or in their other beliefs that there are other beliefs, at least, that are highly valuable to them. And thus capitulating in response to pure disagreements over these kinds of beliefs would result in substantial personal changes. So it's not just like capitulating with respect to the belief about the total cost of the bill at lunch, but something which has a dramatic ripple effect for the person that you are. And sometimes it would require us to do the unthinkable, which is what I think would be true in the case of my sister, for example. If I were to change that belief, I would really, it seems intuitively at any rate, that I would be doing something really morally awful. Okay, so then here's that sub-argument for the premise. If you suspend judgment about your conviction that P in response to pure disagreement, then you're thereby making a sort of deep sacrifice in some aspect of who you are. But it's permissible for you not to sacrifice some aspect of yourself like that. Therefore, it's permissible for you not to suspend judgment about your personal, interpersonal convictions. So just to recap then, if the equal weight view is true, epistemic rationality requires you to make substantial personal changes that you can permissibly refuse. And I think we will find this intuitive when we just reflect on historical cases. So imagine if Martin Luther King really were to capitulate in the face of all the adversity that he had with respect to his beliefs about social justice. Or if Rosa Luxemburg, for example, were to capitulate with respect to her social democratic beliefs, given all of the adversity she faced from the growing fascist movements. Both of these people were, of course, murdered defending what they believe. And so we see them as persons of integrity. And I think what's going on here is that the problem with something like the equal weight view is that it really demands that we divorce the belief that you have from the believer, from the agent that you are, the person that you are. And sometimes we can't make that kind of divorce. We can't really pull them apart in that way. So I guess you could say it requires you to take a step back and abstract and to kind of enter a third person perspective, which means that you'll be distancing yourself so from yourself, so to speak, in a way which is intuitively morally problematic, so much so that we can almost call it a kind of assault on the self, I think. Okay, why is it worth keeping or cultivating? Well, I think integrity reflects self-respect as a person, so everything else being equal, it's a good thing to have. We're not mere vehicles for attitudes or beliefs, but rather some of these beliefs are really integral to the people, the persons that we are. It also reflects wholeness, that you're not fragmented. So you have beliefs which not only fit together in a kind of more abstract, semantic and logical way, but they kind of reflect how you act and how you carry yourself and the kinds of things that you do. So it makes you into like a whole person, right? They really manifest in how you are practically. Okay, now my second argument. So my second argument has to do with our responsibilities, interpersonal responsibilities, in particular the ones we have to the people we care most about. So common sense morality tells us that we owe certain things to people with whom we enjoy a special, personal, loving relationship, like children, friends, companions, and family. We can call this an insider's benefit. So you, prima facie, anyway, you owe more to those with whom you partake in personal, loving relationships than you do to others. So a parent owes more to a child than to some other child. They owe more to their own. A friend owes more to their friends than a stranger, and of course, a partner to a partner as well. So we at least we live our lives this way, but it also seems to reflect a kind of common sense morality, something we think is intuitively correct. So my claim is that these interpersonal responsibilities, these extra responsibilities, they extend to the cognitive domain as well. So just to give you an example of this, consider a case from Simon Keller. So imagine this person, Rebecca, she's about to read some poetry at a cafe. She's nervous, but she wants to do it anyway because she sees herself as a potential writer, poet, and she knows a literary agent will be there. But her best friend, Eric, who frequents the cafe, he has really strong evidence for thinking that the poetry read in these cafes is, pretty bad, mediocre at best. Anything read there is highly unlikely to draw the notice of a literary agent. And he just didn't realize in advance that Rebecca thinks of herself as a poet and he lacks familiarity with her work. So it seems like Eric should give his friend Rebecca the benefit of the doubt, right? But giving her the benefit of the doubt also seems to have cognitive implications. So, for example, he shouldn't just believe like, well, she's likely to not get the attention of the literary agent. Giving her the benefit of the doubt means believing well of her, not just acting as if that's the case, but trying to do one's best so that one truly believes it. And Sarah Stroud reflects this sentiment. So she says, friendship places demands not just on our feelings or our motivations, but on our beliefs and our methods of forming beliefs. So here's a principle I want to kind of tease out of this, at least the first try. If you partake in a personal loving relationship with someone, you prima facie owe it to them to regard them as loving you, right? So if you really are in a loving relationship with someone, you owe it to them to think, well, they believe that they love me. Of course, that's not going to be quite right, because there might be cases where perhaps something shady is going on, or perhaps you know that things aren't going so well. So we have to just modify it with a little caveat and say, if you've ever taken a personal loving relationship with someone and there's no reason to distrust them in this particular case, then you owe it to them to regard them as loving you. It's giving them the benefit of the doubt. And to see why this is plausible, consider something like beliefless friendship. So Frida has been friends with Kathy all of her life, and Kathy regards Frida as a best friend, and their other friends consistently act as if this is so. However, Frida isn't really decided about whether Kathy is her friend at all. For all I can tell, she says, you might be using me for my popularity. You know, she might even add, it might seem to me that you care about me, but I'm not committal about it one way or the other. I think this intuitively wrongs her friend. In this case, Frida wrongs Kathy by not taking a stand, not really having the cognitive commitment, not having the belief that her friend cares about her. And the reason why is, first, it seems like a kind of emotional free riding. So maybe maybe she has the fitting emotional attitude, so she really does care. She really does care, you know, she cares for her. But to lack the doxastic commitment as a friend or as a lover or as a partner, that seems to be wrong. You're just allowing the emotions to free ride here without any of the cognitive commitments. And I also think that we can see, well, we can derive some plausibility from cases like this. Imagine a mean person just says to you, and they believe it, look, I've thought about this extensively, and your children's lives, well, they're actually not worth living. Or alternatively, you don't really love them, or you don't really care about your friends, and so on. Not taking a stand on these sorts of propositions seems wrongful to the person those propositions are about. So you can imagine if your friends or your partner or your children were to find out about such a thing, they would be appalled, right? It would be shameful for you. Okay, so then that is the argument. If you were to suspend judgment about your interpersonal conviction that, say, your spouse or your children love you, then you're flouting your interpersonal responsibilities to them. But it's permissible for you not to flout your responsibilities to them. Therefore, it's permissible for you not to suspend judgment about your interpersonal conviction that they love or care for you, and so on. Okay, so now we're coming closer towards the end here. You might be wondering, which side then should we go for? So there's clearly some problem. We've given support for the two premises. Should we go this encroachment route and say, oh, well, then maybe the equal weight view really isn't true? Or should we go the overriding view and say, well, maybe it is true, but it's of sort of limited value, right? It doesn't get in the way of what we really ought to be doing. So it might be the case that rationality says, hey, you need to conciliate, you need to give your peer equal weight, but really, all things considered, it's okay to stick to your initial judgment. So the encroachment version is, opting for the denial. It's saying it's epistemically inappropriate to suspend judgment because of how bad it is to suspend judgment. But my overriding version says it's all things considered permissible to disobey those kinds of norms. And the encroachment thesis says this: the epistemic status of an attitude depends partly on its moral features. So that means the amount of evidence necessary to make it rational to believe or disbelieve or to suspend can vary with the moral features of the beliefs, namely what the moral stakes are. And in this case, we can see that if I were to revise my belief that my spouse loves me, I would wrong my spouse, or my sister's life. If I were to revise my belief that my sister's life is worth living, I would wrong my sister. And so the encroachment view entails that in each case, my peer needs more evidence. They need to give me a lot more evidence before it should have a revising effect for me. Much more, at least, than an everyday case, like the restaurant one about the bill. So why overriding? That looks like a nice, attractive picture. Well, I think the reason why we should opt for this overriding view is because basically, the encroachment version makes everything still turn on what epistemic rationality really requires of you in cases of deeply interpersonal peer disagreements. And I think that this can be objectionable because really you just shouldn't care that much about what epistemic rationality requires of you in these kinds of cases. Rather, you should be willing to stick to your prior beliefs, even if it's irrational. So you should be willing to make that kind of intellectual sacrifice in order to do, as it were, the right thing. And I think this is kind of an intuitive idea. So just imagine the following kinds of sentences. If God didn't command us not to murder, then I would murder. Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a sort of wrong motivation. I should be motivated not to murder irrespective. Or take this one: if the law didn't forbid stealing your neighbor's things, then it wouldn't be wrong. You could then steal your neighbor's things. Well, no, that's also the wrong motivation. I mean, you should be concerned not to steal your neighbor's things anyway, even if the law didn't forbid it. So now compare that with the following. If epistemic rationality didn't say in these disagreement cases, believe that P, then it wouldn't be wrong to believe that P in these cases. I think that if you're that sensitive to the norms of rationality, you're inadvertently fetishizing the relevant sort of normativity. And I think that kind of indifference to other values, like the moral, the prudential, broadly speaking, is objectionable. You need to be sensitive to, as it were, all the relevant considerations and not only that. It's a bit abstract there, so hopefully everyone caught what I was getting at. But the basic summary is just that the encroachment theorists, to me, sort of, they seem to have objectionable moral and prudential inclinations. So put another way, it shouldn't be the case that the only reason why you are permitted to stick to your guns, so to speak, is because it's rational. Rather, there's other reasons which are even better for to stick to your guns. Whether it's rational or not is something that you don't need to concern yourself with in these limited cases. Okay, now I'm at the objections. And so now we're coming to a close here soon. So the first objection, which I promised we'd come to, is this bad believers problem, right? So you can imagine someone like Norman the Nazi, who is a fully committed Nazi, such that giving up his Nazi convictions would result in him fundamentally altering who he is in his relationship to others. So perhaps he's part of some such community, perhaps his relationships sort of hang on these kinds of convictions. So you might worry, doesn't the personal partiality view imply that Norman can permissibly resist conciliating with his peer who is clearly against such repugnant beliefs? No, my view thankfully does not have this implication. So if one's prior conviction is independently morally wrongful, recall, then they should change their position. That's an outstanding reason to get rid of it, right? So the resulting personal changes they would have to make as a result of conciliating with their peer would have morally good consequences, right? It would, in the end, be morally beneficial. It would be a morally good thing to do. Indeed, keeping the belief by itself does some harm, right? It's bad to think that way of others. The second objection is you might worry that this view permits a kind of dogmatism. And isn't dogmatism a bad thing? Well, the answer here is complicated, yes and no. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about this in tomorrow's lecture. So dogmatism is permissible to the extent that it's not prudentially objectionable to maintain your prior personal and interpersonal convictions in response to peer disagreement. That doesn't entail that it's not criticizable in some way. It is. Someone can criticize you for being epistemically irrational, right? So you're still criticizable for not meeting the standards of epistemic rationality. So you're criticizable in that way. But importantly, you're also praiseworthy, right, along another dimension, right? So you're praiseworthy for being someone of integrity and for someone who's doing their due duty towards the people they care most about. So it's complicated. It's a criticizable dogmatism along one axis, but a praiseworthy kind of dogmatism along another. And I just want to contrast it for a moment with other kinds of dogmatism. So imagine the fundamentalist who is unwilling to consider any relevant challenges to their religious or religious-like positions. The fundamentalist, the difference is that although their commitments are linked up with the self, and they are linked up with their narrative self in their identity, they don't virtuously stand for their positions. So that's the problem with the fundamentalist. So that even if their positions were morally harmful, for example, they would still continue to hold them if they were in fact morally harmful. And they're not sensitive to reasons counting against their views generally. I also want to differentiate it from what I'll call the advocate. So this is someone we all meet, at least as practitioners of theory and philosophy. So this is someone unwilling to consider seriously relevant challenges to their theoretical beliefs. I think this is also different from the personal partiality view, because here we're talking about theoretical beliefs and holding steadfast to those in such a way that you're unwilling to even consider seriously the relevant challenges. That's very different, I think, from being unwilling to consider seriously challenges to your deeply personal and interpersonal convictions, which play those meaning-making roles that I've been citing throughout the talk. The final objection is reason's incomparability. This is a bit of an abstract problem, but just to boil it down, how are we going to compare these two very different kinds of reasons? One's flowing from the prudential pressure not to change your position, and the other flowing from the epistemic pressure to change your position. Well, my reply sort of appeals, funnily enough, to football. So imagine in a football game, we can say the following, that a positional move in the game is correct or the right play, if and only if it's strategically advantageous with respect to fulfilling the goals of football. So the correct play at any time is different from a merely legal play or an allowed play. So imagine the following case. The Giants are just a few yards from their touchdown line, 2 plays until turnover, and the Eagles have a strong defensive line, such that running the ball for a touchdown is unlikely to succeed. The score is close. If the Giants don't score here, time will run out and they'll lose to the Eagles. So the Giants are considering whether to run or pass the ball. What should they do? Let's imagine passing is the correct play. But there's a twist. The match is interrupted suddenly by a terrorist who will detonate a bomb on the field if people don't comply with his demands. What should they do now? Well, clearly what they should do is not pass the ball. That's not what they should do, right? But here's the thing, the terrorist intervention didn't stop the passing the ball from being the correct play. It still is the correct play. It's still what they ought to do in the game. So here's the idea here. Their prudential reason, their reason not to do the correct play, not to pass the ball, is authoritative. It has authority. It is intrinsically weightier than the in-game reasons they have. So authoritative reasons explain what one just plain ought to do. It explains what you really ought to do. So you can kind of figure out when reasons are authoritative by asking the following question. According to this activity or its rules, I should do such and such, but really should I do such and such? And the just plain ought, or the real ought, or the real should, the things that you ought really to do, is operative in the second half of that question. But what really should you do? So according to the normative standards operative in football, the team ought to pass the ball. But really, they shouldn't do that. Not right now, not when there's a terrorist on the field. So the normative standards operative in football don't really have ultimate authority over them, over what they really ought to do. So you might think perhaps epistemic reasons are never authoritative reasons. That's one view you might have. Another view you might have, and this is the one I in fact have, epistemic reasons are authoritative, but the way in which they guide you, the way in which they give you genuine oomph or pressure to do something can be impeded by factors that are intrinsically weightier. Things like moral reasons, for example, or reasons having to do with the character that you have. Okay, so this just has to do with how my view differs from something like saying the equal weight view is spineless. And the difference here is really that this concern about being a spineless person really has to do with having a backbone in theoretical debates. But my concern for integrity is different because it has to do with maintaining deeply personal convictions. And it's not necessarily implausible that epistemic rationality might require you not to have beliefs in areas of controversy or deep controversy, like in philosophy or politics. But it's a completely different matter, I think, in cases of your deeply personal convictions pertaining to those you love and care for the most. So I just want to end here and thank you all. And I look forward to your questions and comments. And yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Chris. That was great. So what we're going to do is you can put your question in the Q&A or raise your hand and we'll call on you. While we're waiting for questions to appear, oh, I've got a question already. Okay, so I'll put myself on the list as well, but I've got one. So Josh has a question. And then, okay, so Josh Dolan, if we could bring him in.
Oh, should I stop sharing, Duncan?
I don't know, Ryan, is that the best way to do it?
Yeah, I think that's fine to stop sharing, and then we can just have.
In fact, why don't I ask a question, and then we'll bring Josh in a minute, and then we'll get like a sort of backlog of questions up and running that way.
Sure. Let me get my notebook here.
Okay, so I want to ask something just about this setup, because I mean, I think the way you set it up is the way a lot of epistemologists think about these things, but to be honest, I don't buy it, and I think we should resist the setup actually for these things. So you seem to take it for granted, like a lot of people do. I think that being open-minded entails being conciliatory. We find this a lot in the debate in the epistemology of disagreement. It's like the sort of opening intuition. if you weren't conciliatory in these cases, then you'd be dogmatic. That's a bad thing. So you should be conciliatory. And then everything else sort of flows from that. But I think that's a very dubious position if you think about it. I mean, it's lent weight by these toy examples people use. And often in philosophy, I think the toy examples are part of the problem, like the restaurant case and so on. But it seems to me that being open-minded, as we normally understand it, it doesn't mean being conciliatory at all. It means it's something like it's like other regarding traits. It means things like listening to other people, being willing to open dialogue and so on, to respect other people's opinions, be open to the possibility they might persuade you otherwise, and so on. But there's nothing there that entails any kind of conciliatoriness. And as I say, I think the toy example is part of the joker in the pack here, because I don't think that's the kind of case we should focus on, right? Those kind of cases strip away a lot of what's really interesting about disagreements. I mean, take a disagreement where it's something that you really have thought about. It could be an interpersonal belief in your sense, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something you've thought a lot about. And then someone comes along with an opposing view. And again, we've got to be careful with peer. We don't define it such that we get conciliatoriness by default.
Sure. We
just have it that they're reasonable and they've had access. I mean, again, sameness of evidence. Who in normal cases, no way of knowing. But broadly speaking, well, yeah, you should listen to them. Yeah, and should take them seriously and so on. But there's no, as it stands, you don't have to concede. And I think actually, when we think about intellectually virtuous people, that's exactly what they do. Like I always like to give Ernie Souza as a good example here, because I think everyone agrees he's intellectually virtuous. He is wonderfully patient. People like me come along with our objections. He's kind and detailed, and he'll go through and explain everything. I've never heard him concede anything. And I've never, it would be bizarre to think that's a sign of his dogmatism. I think, open-mindedness is essentially an other regarding trait. It's not about the way this setup goes. It's like a focus on you, but it really, what's interesting about these traits is that they're other regarding. Their focus is on other people and how you deal with them. So I think if you take that kind of route, you can, a lot of the worries, a lot of the puzzles you're trying to solve, they don't actually arise, like, for example, maybe I'll stop there. I mean, I think with that I haven't really gone into the interpersonal beliefs case. So I think they do have an interesting character actually, but I don't think there is as yet the prima facie problem of accounting for why there might be certain commitments you should be steadfast about. Without that entailing that you're dogmatic. That's my concern about the setup.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Duncan. I can see that open-mindedness is other regarding and entails things like listening and a kind of standing willingness to listen to the person's reasons and evaluate them with them and so on. But I think I did say at the outset that we should think of open-mindedness as more or less demanding depending on the source of the challenge, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is, how much we disagree here actually. So I was sort of thinking of it like, well, if I'm getting a challenge to say a theoretical belief from someone who I know knows more about this than I do, and if I really am open-minded, it wouldn't be enough for me just to kind of listen to the arguments that they give me. It wouldn't be enough just to kind of like process it and then go, well, I still don't see how that leads to the alternative view that you hold. I think that if I was really open-minded, that means taking seriously other people's positions means more than just working through their views. Like, you sometimes actually have to be really prepared to change your own position in light of their criticisms. And I guess it's not clear to me what you're arguing is not really bottoming out in something like, well, actually dogmatism is sometimes virtuous, right?
Sorry, I was going to say, but notice the way you put it there, that doesn't entail conciliatory. That doesn't say conciliationism, right? Conciliationism is the view that you have to downgrade at the beginning. Of course, you may subsequently downgrade, right? And that might happen.
Right.
But that's a different view. The conciliatory view is precisely at that moment you are now rationally required. There's a rational requirement on you to downgrade, and I don't think that's there at all. I think the restaurant bill is kind of like the wrong kind of case, because, well, if I thought about this, no, I mean, but like imagine a case where you really have something you've thought long and hard about, and then someone comes, people come along. And I think this is especially in the interpersonal case, I mean, like, so I think you're not giving full credit, like with your sister, for example. There are all kinds of reasons that you have, and I'm sure there's no one.
Sure.
As you know, I mean, I'm in a similar situation with my son, right? So, you encounter people who believe these things, and then I think you're probably underestimating the rational resources available to you. And I think you could make a case. It's not like there's no standing, I think, obligation to downgrade there. And I think lots of cases where you've reflected on something and thought about it, even if the person coming along, is pretty authoritative and so on, well, you should listen to them. Maybe they'll convince you. You should be open to it. But you can, and I actually think this is really important. This idea, this conciliation idea, is actually has a pernicious effect on society. We see a lot with students. I think they think they're having conviction means listening to someone, right? Because if you were to listen to them, that would mean you don't have conviction, and it's important to have conviction. But one thing we have this virtues project here is try and get students to see that you can have conviction and listen, be respectful, and listen to others. They're perfectly compatible, right? They're both virtue. They both be virtuous traits. Yeah,
right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So then, I mean, just as a kind of technical response. So maybe the right thing to say then is open-mindedness doesn't straightforwardly lead to the conciliatory or narrower still an equal weight, like a tendency to give equal weight kind of posture. But then I can still sort of salvage my basic criticism by going, well, the equal weight view itself runs into this trouble with these personal and interpersonal cases, right? With integrity and your kind of mutual responsibilities that you have, towards the people you care most about and what they hold towards you. So
yeah, I mean, I think the fault is the equal weight view. That's the thing that should go.
Okay, right.
It doesn't capture. So then you can have these prudential obligations, these epistemic obligations. There's not necessarily a conflict there.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah. Well, then thanks for the suggestion and the helpful criticism.
Okay, thanks very much. So Josh.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't see my picture here, but so long as you hear me, that's fine.
Yeah, I hear you.
Great to meet you. Thank you so much for this talk. It was excellent. Yeah, I learned a lot, so thank you.
Thank you.
Just a few things here. Some of this is playing a little devil's advocate, some of it isn't, but things. I wonder why who I am as a rational agent can't be an essential aspect of myself, right? So that certain commitments, certain personal beliefs, these are a part of who I essentially am, and so I shouldn't give that up. Well, it seems that you're asking us in certain situations to give up this sort of self-image that one has as a rational agent, someone who responds to reason, right? And so I wonder if it could be clearer in your and the paper you're working on to say why rationality isn't on that list. The second thing is that I just wonder. I wonder if maybe some doubt, maybe lowering confidence in one's belief that, one's central beliefs that seem to support, in the way you suggest, the strength of the interpersonal relationship. Maybe some doubt there is actually a good thing. Maybe it makes the relationship more lively, non-complacent, or maybe it makes room for trust. Certain things like that can actually strengthen the relationship, not just weaken it. So I'm just wondering if you thought about it from that angle as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, actually. I mean, that gives me a lot to ponder, to be honest. So in the paper version, I do consider like the case where someone just becomes a little less confident. So they don't sort of like abandon belief, like the more extreme examples that I have in the talk, but they just become less confident. Still enough for kind of like partial belief, but not enough for full belief. And the examples I give sort of suggest that there's still something criticizable there. But I haven't really thought about what you just said now, which is that, well, perhaps that opens up some space to strengthen the relationship, maybe to make it more lively, make the people involved not complacent. So I have to think about that. I mean, this to me is more plausible in the case of a relationship with like a partner or a spouse, and it's less plausible in the case of one's child, right? Or it could hold, I think, with a sibling, for example, or a friend, but then it'll of course turn on their own like cognitive capacity. So what I'm just driving at there is maybe lowering my confidence with respect to someone I deeply care about, like my sister. That in this way, I think would be more problematic than it would be if I were to do it with my spouse. And likewise, if I were to lower my confidence in this way with respect to, say, children, right? I think that would be more problematic than it would be if I did it with my best friend or my spouse. So I think its prudential acceptability will maybe just turn on the peculiarities of the interpersonal relationships. That's just my off-the-cuff response. But actually, I mean, this is a really interesting avenue for me to explore. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think you're absolutely right that, at least for some people, who they are as epistemically rational agents will form part of their identity and their sort of narrative self. And we can also imagine that they really are an intellectualist, so to speak. So it forms part of their, perhaps their ground projects, right? Yeah, and in that case, then maybe what I'm calling a sacrifice, right, is for them too much of a sacrifice. So I say, hey, you should, sacrifice a bit of your rationality in order to express loyalty towards those who are owed it, and also, of course, to manifest self-respect for yourself as a person. But it seems like if you really were the sort of person that where epistemic rationality forms, it's a central feature of who you are. You're the intellectual, and a sort of deep intellectual. Then I think the situation might change, because then the ideal, the value becomes a bit heavier, becomes weightier. And I was sort of building it into my cases where it didn't seem as weighty as the other values that we were looking at. But admittedly, I just have to think about both of these two things more deeply. So thanks for raising it. That'll be helpful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Josh. So the next question is Doigu.
Yeah, I don't hear you yet.
You're muted.
Now I'm in. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, now.
Okay. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. No video. Okay. I had first a question of clarification. I would really appreciate some more detail on why you think that the independence argument or independence view boils down to saying that only higher order evidence matters. Because I haven't read in detail Christensen 2011, but it seemed to me that the way you presented the view is that when we are evaluating the epistemic credentials of the other's view, let's say on whether P, we should not count in our first order evidence, which is, let's say, like subjective evidence mostly, or our evaluations of the evidence, maybe even not counting objective evidence in determining the epistemic value of the other position. So that would leave us with the other party's first order evidence. It only disqualifies my subjective first order evidence on whether P. So not higher order evidence. So that would be, I guess that would benefit from more clarification. And the second is sort of an open-ended question. I guess it is more directly related to the encroachment view, but I guess it might be applied to your overriding view or argument as well. And it's that you've presented the objection regarding the fundamentalist who has really steadfast views, religious or religious-like views on topics that he or she would never give up in the face of peer disagreement. But actually, the situation is not that black and white. When we begin to talk about identity or meaning conferring beliefs, people really are in a wide range. And for some people, really a very small set of beliefs are of the sort that you can call identity or meaning conferring. And for some people, a very large quantity of beliefs become a matter of personal integrity or determinants of whether one's life is worth living, and so on. So when we have such heterogeneity, it becomes difficult to talk about peers, really, in this case, because one party would be maybe, let's say, quite liberal about a large majority of their beliefs, and the other party would not be so. So I guess when we count in that dimension as well, it is not just the argument from a fundamentalist or an advocate. It's just for everyone. It would be a very diverse range. And those people would like never be on an equal or maybe comparable footing. So that's it. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, no, it was. Thank you. So I'll just go backwards. So just to clarify what I meant with the fundamentalists, I guess I didn't make this clear I went through that pretty quickly. So what I meant is not a disagreement with a fundamentalist. I was just trying to, because I agree with the following point that if a fundamentalist in a disagreement with someone else about their religious-like conviction, they're probably not engaging an epistemic peer or otherwise someone they would regard as an epistemic peer. So I agree with that. But what I had in mind is just, I was trying to distinguish between the kind of dogmatism that a fundamentalist has with respect to their conviction and the kind of dogmatism that I think is permissible with respect to your personal meaning-making and interpersonal convictions. But even with that clarification in play, I also see I feel the force of the suggestion that, well, not every fundamentalist is the same. You shouldn't just take it for granted that they're all as dogmatic as the toy fundamentalist I considered is. So I imagine the fundamentalist as someone who has a religious or religious-like conviction, because of course there's also non-religious fundamentalists, and they are unwilling to consider seriously relevant challenges to their beliefs, where relevant challenges are coming from highly reliable evidential sources. So this makes them a peculiar kind of dogmatist. So they're kind of dismissing all kinds of relevant evidence. And I was just trying to separate my sort of dogmatism that I thought is permissible from the sort of dogmatism they exemplify. But I recognize that it is like a very specific kind of dogmatism, because there will be, fundamentalists, because there will be fundamentalists maybe who aren't that dogmatic. Okay, encroachment. Yeah, so I guess what I was trying to drive at there, also I went really quickly there, is it struck me that with the encroachment view, the impulse is to say something like this: it would only be acceptable to maintain the belief in the face of peer controversy only if it were rational to do so. And so my complaint is, yeah, but an agent just shouldn't be that concerned with being rational in these kinds of cases. And so now, to come back to the encroachment theorist, I would say, look, I mean, where is the concern coming from? Isn't it enough that there already are good reasons to be steadfast, whether being steadfast is rational or not, right? So that's the idea, is that we already have sufficiently strong reasons not to budge. Why does it need to be the case that only if it were rational not to budge, only then that's when you shouldn't budge? And I think it's the impulse towards saying something like that that is kind of motivating the idea that the prudential and moral are encroaching on the epistemic. That's the meat of the complaint. But I grant that it's really hard for me to put it, for me to make this complaint clear and, difficult to make it convincing. But yeah, I hope that helped.
Okay, thanks to you.
But thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
You're muted if you wanted to come back, but
and
okay,
oh yeah, you do.
We'll bring in Anna's
Okay.
next. Anna's next on the list, so bring Anna.
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me, or you also see me maybe?
Yes, yeah, here and see you. So.
Okay, so thank you so much. That was really a great talk. A lot of interesting stuff to think about. I have a worry regarding still the overriding view versus encroachment view.
Mm-hmm.
So this is maybe a variant of the objection that you already considered. So what is the relationship between the epistemic rationality, the epistemic reasons, and other kinds of reasons? So my worry is this. It seems to me that dividing sharply between the epistemic reason and other reason does not do justice to the way in which we think ourselves sometimes. It looks like it is part of our really general we might say general aims and general identity to try to be coherent, right? And to try to believe what we need to believe, what we know that we should believe, and make this coherent with the other values and priorities we might have. Yeah. While the overriding view seems to overlook this aspect, or at least to say just what you were saying at the end of the answer now to the last question, that we shouldn't be that concerned if we have other reasons that lead us to keep faith to certain beliefs, even if we know that we shouldn't from the point of view of epistemic rationality. So it's like the intuitive idea that we have about the coherence of ourselves, in my view, seems to be a bit missing, or at least, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I see what you're. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So, yeah, basically, my account, it's overlooking the integration, the lived integration of the practical and moral with the epistemic, such that we don't really treat them so differently in everyday life. And when I do this sharp division, I'm not doing justice to this fact about everyday life, right? I think there's something to that. I guess what I was trying to get at, and maybe, yeah, it's something like, well, when you take on the third person point of view, and you really are become interested in questions just pertaining to truth and avoiding error, so you kind of like put on the epistemologist hat. For me, when a person engages in that kind of reflective and goal-oriented activity, where the goals now are like epistemic, or getting at truth and knowledge and avoiding error and ignorance, yeah, it seems to me you are bracketing the moral and the practical. It seems to me that that's part of what we just mean when we say something like from an epistemological point of view, or the epistemic perspective. We just mean that. And I do think it's right, though, that in everyday life, taking on this third personal epistemic perspective is not it's not typical. It's not, it's not part of the typical agent's life. It's not part of their existence so much. But it is part of the theoretician's existence, right? So it's the kind of perspective that they take on, and I think that's what can lead us as theoreticians, whether it be a philosopher or a physicist or a psychologist and sociologist and so on, to consider kind of very abstract, distant possibilities, right? So maybe this doesn't actually address your question at all. I guess I was just trying to get at the point that, yes, I think you're right that these things are kind of integrated in everyday life, but it's not clear to me that we should say for that reason that they aren't actually divided. And I think that when because we can engage in this third person reflective enterprise, that it's kind of like, some reason to think that there is an epistemic perspective, and there is a moral perspective, and there is a broader prudential perspective which factors in aesthetic value, eudaimonia, well-being, and so on. But maybe that's my inner Cartesian speaking. Don't know. So look, I see that I didn't answer the question in a satisfying way, but I guess, yeah, I'm not so sure how to do that just now. So.
I think you did.
Confession.
I think you did, actually. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, but thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Anna. We've got time for more questions if anyone wants to put a hand up. I have another thing I wanted to add, actually.
Sure.
This is an objection to you. I'm just kind of curious to know what you think about it. Integrity strikes me as a really interesting notion, and I'm not really sure exactly how to think about it. And some of the quotations you gave, I thought were very interesting, because let's give some examples, right? So a lot of the ways in which those quotations think about integrity, all that seems to matter is, as it were, sticking to your convictions. So, for example, Hitler would come out as having a man of great integrity, right? I mean, he sticks to his convictions in the face of adversity, very brave, and so on. Like maybe we might want to think that people with terrible views have integrity. I don't know. I mean, you talk about Bernard Williams, and Bernard Williams says that his big overarching issue for him is really integrity, and how that overrides other values and so on. Gauguin abandons his family. I mean, he was right, right? You know, I mean, he produced great art. He made a prediction that it was a risky prediction that by abandoning his family going off to Tahiti, he would produce great art, but it worked out for him.
Right.
In one sense, you might say, well, yeah, but that's integrity. I mean, he has terrible values or something like that, but that's integrity. You know, but Anna Karenina, the other example Williams talks about, I mean, it goes wrong for her. But again, you know, I mean, that seems kind of, well, she had to commit to Vronsky, but it was a doomed love affair. Terrible consequences for her, not her fault. Just the society. I mean, there weren't terrible consequences for him because of the patriarchal system that she's in and so on.
Right.
So here's what I'm getting at. The one thought you might have is that maybe we need a distinction between, as it were, integrity and virtuous integrity or something like that.
Yeah.
That maybe this, you know, maybe Hitler has something like, he has some of these kind of underlying traits of integrity. So he kind of sense he comes out as having some general notion of integrity, but he doesn't have the virtuous notion. So that's one thought I had, and I wonder what you thought about that. And then another thought I had about integrity. I mean, a lot of those quotations, it's about it seemed to me a very 21st century notion of integrity. It's about standing for it. What badges are you willing to wear? You know. And you know, when I think of integrity, and I think this is more like an older version of integrity. You know, I think of it more as like integrity is like a kind of a quiet integrity. You know, like it's Gary Cooper in High Noon or something like that. It's not showy. It's not badge wearing or something.
Right.
And I wonder, you know, a lot of these accounts of integrity, they just seem very much like it. You know, I think it goes along with this sort of worries about virtue signaling and so on. They're very much about what's your PR, as it were. Whereas I think there's another way of thinking about integrity, which I think is an older one, which is the PR stuff doesn't come into the badge wearing. It's more like, as it were, it's not, your integrity is revealed by what you do in the sort of this, you know, like think about High Noon, you know, Gary, everyone, all the rest of the townsfolk, they might wear the badges and so on, but when it comes to it, they desert him, right? But his integrity is, he doesn't back down, right? But so, you know, I don't know. So these are hard things to judge, I think, because, you know, you might think, well, maybe it is the badge wearing, you know, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, sometimes the badge wearing is brave and so on. I don't know. So I just wanted those two thoughts about if maybe you thought about integrity and you could help us out a bit.
Yeah. So there is okay, well, I guess I should start with the more narrow point, which is I sort of derived this standing for requirement by reflecting on these ideas about integrity. And then the idea was something like, one manifests their integrity by standing for a position in the sense that I sketched, but that's different from virtuously standing for it. So the idea would be something like, yeah, so then someone who has a morally repugnant position, like Hitler, for example, in that sense, he might have stood for certain beliefs rather than merely had the beliefs, right? He stood for them, but he didn't do so in the virtuous way, and that was because, like, well, those requirements weren't satisfied, right? Because the belief was independently morally harmful. So even if it wasn't morally harmful for him to stand for the belief, it had moral spillover effects for others that made it morally harmful, which reduced the potential virtuosity such a belief might otherwise have. Yeah, so I do then, so now coming back up to the more general idea of integrity, so coming up from this point about standing for a belief, yeah, so there is this real question. I mean, yeah, are there terrible people who have integrity? I mean, on the face of it, the answer seems no. I mean, just as a matter of kind of intuition, I mean, you wouldn't say something like, well, like, here's a person of real integrity, and then you point to like Pol Pot or like Stalin or Hitler or something like that. So those kinds of examples seem to reveal that you can stand for a conviction, and yet it's not really a manifestation of integrity. So like that's one kind of view. And the other kind of view, you know, says, well, no, because integrity is intrinsically a virtue, and so it just isn't really possible for someone to stand for something like that and it be a manifestation of integrity. I guess I do feel the force of like just the straightforward examples, right? Well, here's Pol Pot, here's Stalin, here's Hitler. They stood for, position A, position B, and position C, but were they really people of integrity? Were they thereby people of integrity or manifesting integrity? Intuitively not. On the other hand, it seems to, maybe it's just a more plausible route to say, well, it was a manifestation of integrity, but as you say, not thereby a manifestation of virtue. So maybe integrity is only sometimes a virtue and sometimes it's a vice. And this is also true of like, even things like things like dogmatism and open-mindedness. So dogmatism is only sometimes a vice, other times it's a virtue. Open-mindedness is only sometimes a virtue, other times it's a vice. It sort of just depends upon the broader social environment that you're in. So
yeah, I mean, for independent reasons, I don't like those kind of views, like virtue.
okay.
But let me just, if I may, just a little bit of pressure on this. So like Hitler, what does it mean to stand virtuously? So, I mean, he's very brave, right? I mean, one way of reading what you're saying there is standing virtuously is kind of like some sort of factive notion. You have to value the things that are worth valuing or something. And that's where it's not that he stands, right. It's not that he lacks virtue in the way he stands for what he believes in, because he doesn't lack virtue in that sense. It's that he lacks virtue in that his judgment about what you should stand for is wrong or something like that. And that sounds kind of right. It sounds like, Hitler,
right.
That's where it wasn't his standing. It was what his judgment about what's worth standing for. But then there are these other cases. Like, I suppose you're an atheist, you could still admire like the life of a saint or something, and their martyrdom, and you might say, "Wow, that's these are incredible people. They showed great integrity or whatever," even though you think that they were standing for the wrong things. Yeah, and that seems generally true, right? You can admire people even though you don't agree with their values. So there's got to be some way in which we can make sense of integrity where we're not committed to endorsing the values that they're standing for.
Yeah, so I find the saint case really intriguing because, I think that's plausible. So I admire the saint and the way in which they, I admire Joan of Arc, for example, right? Even though I don't share her convictions, but I wonder if then the key difference between a Joan of Arc case and a Hitler case is something like, in the Hitler case, the conviction is just so morally condemnable. It's so morally repugnant that it kind of overshadows any kind of virtue that might be manifest in standing for a conviction. Whereas in so it's not just merely thinking the conviction is false, but it's false and morally repugnant. Whereas in the saint case with Joan of Arc, it's finding the conviction false, but not morally repugnant, right? In fact, you might even admire the conviction itself. Go like, well, I wish I were someone who were such that I could believe in that kind of way. Even if you don't, in fact, have those kinds of beliefs, you don't share her conviction. So, at first blush, then I would have to say something like, in the kind of like, Hitler kind of case, where we're reacting not only to the falsity of the belief, but the moral repugnance of the belief, and that might overshadow whatever virtue attaches to the standing for that belief. Whereas in the Joan of Arc case, we're merely criticizing the conviction in terms of truth or falsity, but we're admiring the way she stands for it.
Okay, good. What about the sort of Bernard Williams cases then, where there's another value outweighs the moral value? So like the great artists like the Gauguin,
Right.
you know, they ignore all the moral codes of the day. I mean, is some degree of moral repugnance okay if the values that outweigh it are also values or something? I mean, is that, you know, like Hitler case, you might say there's nothing, it's moral repugnance and there's nothing to outweigh it. Gauguin, great art, right? So there is something to outweigh it. And well, okay, you know, Williams rejects this idea that the moral trumps everything else. So yeah, the aesthetic is that's something worth having, you know. You know, or maybe it could be a mountain climber or something. You know, they're terrible people in some respects, you know, but they're so driven and single-minded, but they do these amazing feats, and that has a certain value.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really good, and also unfortunately really difficult. So so he definitely produced great art, and there's the value in everybody else being able, well, most people perhaps being in a position to appreciate his artwork. And then also there's like kind of the well-being promotion, like for him to produce such art, right? So I mean, think about what it would have been like for him if he couldn't live his life producing art. I mean, that would be a massive well-being deprivation for him. But for sure, he did. There were, you know, moral costs, right, for his family, and I mean, also, you know, moral costs for the people he like depicted. He didn't necessarily treat them with respect and how they ought to be treated. So yeah, there are like direct and indirect moral costs. But yeah, I mean, how to weigh the aesthetic benefit and also the personal well-being benefit against the moral. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the answer there. That's a really difficult question. I'm also sympathetic to the idea that the moral doesn't automatically override any other kind of reasons that you have. The only thing I really meant in the talk is that the moral reasons are intrinsically weightier than the epistemic ones, but not that they're intrinsically weightier than any other addition of reasons, right? So maybe if you have some aesthetic reasons to phi and some epistemic reasons to phi or get yourself in a position to phi, that can outweigh the moral reason not to phi, right? It was more like just like a direct comparison, right? So yeah, but thanks for that. I mean, these are fun and difficult things to think about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So I think probably this will be our final question, but Andrew, if you'd like to ask your question.
We can't hear you, Andrew.
Hang on. I don't think he's okay. Oh, here he is. So just unmute yourself, Andrew, so we can hear you.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, mute. Unmute. Okay. Start my video. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I just had just to continue a little bit the discussion of about integrity. I don't have any big major problems to raise, except it's a problem for myself, like for you all apparently, to understand, you know, what integrity means and what how we should talk about integrity. And I was thinking back to your talk yesterday, Chris, about your discussions about extremism. And I guess my little question is, you know, what the relationship between extremism and integrity is, might be, and how to talk about a person who maybe is extremely integral or acts with extremist integrity. Is it possible to be extremistly, do we want to say it's possible to be extremistly, to have extremist integrity? And I guess I'm inclined to say well, I don't know. I don't like to use the word extremist in general for various reasons. For a long time, that's been bothering me. But anyway, I'd be interested, excuse me, in what you might have to say about this. Duncan, a minute ago, you were talking about admiring how we should talk about a person who stands for values that we don't have. And my question, I guess, my thought is, well, what about, how should we talk about a person who stands for values that we do have, but stands for them in a way that we don't stand for them, you know, and stands for them in a way that some of us at least would be inclined to say they're extremist in their stand for values. And I'm thinking a couple cases. Say John Brown and the abolitionists in whatever the time was, 150 years ago now, whatever it was, he's thought to be a man. Many of us who have abolitionist sentiments then and now thought nonetheless that he was an extremist, because in some sense he was going too far, to stand for his values. And I don't know, I just have problems myself, I guess, talking that way about him. But how should, I'm not sure how I want to talk about him even, or more currently, some of us, I have mixed feelings about the question of abortion. But a lot of us, obviously, in this culture are pro-life, are against abortion, and that's a deep value that many of us has. But some of us who have that value are also against extremist manifestations of that value, and are against, for example, of assassinating abortion providers or blowing up abortion clinics and so on. So what about that? I think I ask myself. And then one other one maybe that occurs to me is this phenomenon of having to do with homosexuality, the phenomenon of shunning, where there are a lot of us who are, just to put it crudely, against homosexual orientation or homosexual behavior. But and I guess the people in particular I'm thinking of are people who have daughters or sons or friends or spouses who are homosexual, and their response to their daughters or sons who are homosexual is to shun them in one way or another, to excommunicate them from some community or other that they're a part of. And they do that because they think they have to. It's a matter of integrity for them to, given their commitment to the wrongness, of homosexual behavior. They think that I don't like to throw my daughter out of my house, but I have to, because homosexuality is contrary to God's will. And so I'm sorry, but my hands are tied. I can't help this. And, the phenomenon I'm interested in here is similar to the others, where a lot of us, I myself don't share this view that homosexuality is contrary to God's will and related views, but a lot of us do. And a lot of those of us who do share that value also claim that throwing your daughter out of the house because she's lesbian is an extremist implementation of this fundamental value. So we share the value, but we don't share the what I'd call an integrated expression of the value. So anyway, how about that? What do you think? Is it possible to be extremistly? Is it possible for integrity to be extremist, would you say, in what I'm saying?
No, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess I want to be cautious, because I don't necessarily want to say that you can manifest integrity in an extreme way, or like with great abundance, so to speak. But at the same time, I do see what you're saying with the examples. So maybe I'll just take on the, how do we deal with people who stand for the same convictions that we have, but they do so differently, right? So they do so extremely. So, I mean, just speaking for myself for a moment. So I'm a vegetarian and believe in the welfare of animals. But then when I think about terrorist organizations, basically, who blow up meat factories, or go to farms and sort of like release all the animals into the wild, or farm animals into the wild, I think like, well, I don't stand for that. So what's going on? Well, I think there's two things. So one is we stand for the same underlying conviction, which is we stand for animal liberation, right? We stand for the abolition of using animals in these terrible ways. But at the same time, I don't stand for blowing up factories, right? I don't stand for going on people's farms and releasing all the animals. So I don't stand for that. So there's two different things here then. There's kind of like the method and then the object of the attitude, right? So the content. So I stand for the content, I don't stand for the method. And that's where calling their method extreme in a kind of pejorative way, at least, gets its force, right? So it's like, well, I don't identify, I don't align with them, because they go further, they go much further, and they execute these extreme methods that I don't stand for. So that would be one kind of difference. And I imagine that people who do that would look at me and they would say, well, I don't really stand for animal liberation because I'm not out there liberating the animals, right? And I think that really shows that they are extremists then, because extremists are concerned with ideological purity, right? And also with using methods which sort of like, I guess, demonstrably brings into the real world the vision of social reality that they demand and desire, right? And then so when we disagree over the methods, even though we agree over the conviction, the differences are really borne out there. And I think your case about the person who's like a theist or a Christian or something like that, but who stands against homosexuality, is that a manifestation of their of integrity when they throw their daughter out on the street? I mean, what I would say there is that so what's going on there is it seems like they're not responding responsibly to their interpersonal duties, right? Like he has a real obligation to his daughter that he needs to make good on, and he's not making good on it. And in that case, I think the weight of the duty you owe to your children, and in this case to his daughter, is just greater than whatever weight his integrity, his religious integrity has here, I think. I mean, there will be certain limits to that. So, maybe if his religious convictions conflict with, I don't know, her getting a certain kind of tattoo or whatever, that's a different story than like, her becoming homeless, right? And not having a family to come back to. I think that's just a person who clearly has the wrong priorities and is prioritizing their, maintaining the religious conviction and whatever integrity flows from that over the interpersonal obligation they really owe their daughter. So hope that's helpful.
Very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so we should finish there. So thanks very much, Chris. That was a very entertaining session. Chris's final lecture in this series will be tomorrow. And like this one, it's on the similar themes. It's quite overlapping. It's quite interesting how the one yesterday's overlapped a bit with the one today. And I can see how the one tomorrow can connect as well. So the title for tomorrow is Personalism About the Ethics of Belief. So I hope to see some of you there. And thanks again to Chris for a very interesting talk.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you.